Hi, good morning, everyone. What a great first talk. And I'm Jane Greenberg. I'm a professor in the College of Computing and Informatics at Drexel University. I also direct the Metadata Research Center, so I'm very interested in data and data quality and semantics and all those kinds of things, which really plays in nicely with this. It is my honor to be the moderator of this first panel, and I just would like to thank the organizers of this whole day. It's really great to be here and just to be in this gorgeous building. So enjoy the scenes. The way that we're going to run this panel is the panelists will speak 5 to 7 to 10 minutes maximum, because all of you are here and we really want to have time for questions and dialogue. So they all know that if they get to 7 minutes, I'm going to be like shaking my paper, and then let them have an opportunity to wrap up, and then you folks can line up. So I'm going to start with the first bio note. And so Dr. Elo is our first presenter. And Dr. Elo is a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She holds a PhD and MPA from Princeton University, with her doctorate being in public affairs and demography. A driving research question that motivates her work is what accounts for race, ethnic, and socioeconomic differences in health and mortality. For context, race, ethnic, and socioeconomic differences in health and mortality are well known, but factors that underlie them are less clearly understood. Her research focuses on how societal inequalities affect these health disparities across the course of life, including possible effects on early life conditions and neighborhood context. Her research projects include the analysis of race, ethnic disparities in maternal, infant, and child health in Philadelphia and nationally, early life conditions in adult mortality in Finland, and differences in mortality among native-born and foreign U.S.-born residents and black and white in avoidable mortality in the United States. So welcome, Dr. Elo. We're ready for your presentation.
Well, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts on issues that relate to data in the social sciences. You see how this works? I don't have a lot of time, so I just want to quickly share with you some thoughts on these 5 topics. Some of what I will have to say will also overlap with the excellent keynote speaker, but much more at the general level. And what I'm hoping that this will generate some additional thoughts for discussion. So let me start quickly what I mean by representativeness. So in my field, we worry a lot about how representative our data are in terms of race, age, race ethnicity, socioeconomic status, whether measured by educational attainment or other measures of SES. And that has implications of how generalizable our findings are, whether they are generalizable at the national level or at the local level or at the state or regional level. And one of the things we worry about that many clinical studies really are not representative of a broad range of population, and then how do we generalize across socioeconomic status, across age, across race ethnicity. There are several concerns that have come up in recent years in this area. Many of us use data from social surveys, and declining response rates have become increasingly problematic. They can also vary by type of data. Many social scientists are beginning to integrate biomarkers and genetic data into social science surveys, and this has become an issue of people willing to participate. But it is complementary to clinical studies that would provide biological and genetic data on a representative samples of the US population or other nations. Part of the problem here has to do with cell phones and landlines also, so cell phone surveys or phone surveys are becoming increasingly problematic for generalizability. Many of you probably don't answer cell phones if you don't know where the call is coming from, or you're not going to want to spend an hour on your cell phone answering survey data. The other issue that is related here is missing data, although we have statistical methods for handling missing data, and they are improving over time, it's still a problematic and leads questions about how do we fill in the information that's missing on the survey data. So in Scandinavia, for many decades, or centuries really, there has been a lot of usage of administrative record and register-based data, but this is becoming much more recent effort in the United States. So many survey data now can be and have been linked to IRS tax records to provide much better information on income, which is poorly generally reported. There's an increased linkages to Medicare and Medicaid data in social science surveys to get a better information on health and health outcomes and utilization of services. And there has been a big effort to try to integrate federal and state level administrative records data for policy relevant research. This has been really driven by former Census Bureau Director Bob Groves, who is now provost at the Georgetown University. And there was this bipartisan commission on evidence-based policymaking that really tried to push forward linkages of administrative records both to survey data, to census data, and other data sources that are widely used. I'm giving you a couple of citations here. National Academy of Sciences has published couple of very important volumes in this regard, and the state level policymaking commission is still working. The other data that was somewhat alluded to has to do with big data. Social scientists are increasingly beginning to use large volumes of data that provide information on all aspects of social life. And I've just listed some of the things on this slide, including social media, web searches, blogs, and other internet from administrator on websites, and so on. I think here we are very in the beginning stages of really know how to analyze these data. And I think that was also discussed a little bit in terms of the medical record and medical sciences. And I think there is really important need here for training that combines social scientists, probably medical scientists if we want to do health record data, but also data scientists. And I think it's really important not to bring these individuals together because each fields have specific questions they want to answer. And data scientists alone probably won't be able to integrate all the information that social scientists might be interested in, and we don't have the methodologies to really how to best utilize these data. But one of the things that's important here is that these are very easily and quickly available, or more quickly and easily available than spending millions of dollars trying to do survey data. So they are beginning to be used more frequently to try to answer social science questions as well. And they can also be integrated with other data sources. So one issue that was spent a lot of time on in the other talk was replication of findings. In the social sciences, it's becoming more common for journals to ask you to provide the code that you use to write your article so that someone can actually rerun the code on the data that you used to do your analysis, so that the replication in that sense is important. Obviously, this will slow down the review process, and this is more common in economics at the moment than in other social sciences, but it's also becoming common in demography. But there is this concern of a slow review process because people have to spend a lot of time reading the code, and sometimes very complicated code, and also getting the data. But I think this is a very important development, especially in social sciences, where mostly we use observational data. And as was pointed out earlier, depending on what variables you include in your analysis, you can get very different kinds of results. So I think the replication in this respect is important, and it's becoming more common. There are several things in this area that are important to think about. Not all data may be publicly available. Social scientists try to push data to be publicly available. but often that may not be the case. And so code can be easily shared. There should be no problem with that, but the data issues may be important. And my final point has to do with confidentiality. I think one of the reasons why the survey response rates are going down is increased concerns about confidentiality of the data. And this relates to all the other data sources that I mentioned. The use of administrative records, how do we obtain informed consent for individuals whose records we are using? Often that may not be possible, but it may be important to think about. Big data also raises some ethical issues regarding consent and how do we obtain that. Given that the increased concerns of confidentiality, also data sources that used to be publicly available from the federal government are increasingly restricted and are only available in census research data centers or under individual agreements from data collectors, and that will affect some of the replicability issues and also researchers' access to the data. So the confidentiality issues, I think, are important not only perhaps in the medical sciences, but they are just as important in the social sciences. So thanks very much. I hope that raises some questions for us to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next presenter is Dr. Giszter. Dr. Giszter is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology and Anatomy at Drexel University College of Medicine. Prior to coming to Drexel in 1994, he spent several years at MIT, first as a postdoctoral researcher and then as a research scientist. He has a joint faculty appointment in the School of Biomedical Engineering, Sciences, and Health Systems at Drexel. He has a long history of collaboration with members of the Spinal Cord Injury Research Center and with laboratories in the School of Bioengineering Science and Health Systems and the College of Engineering at Drexel. His research interests are in spinal cord organization, modularity, and control of limb biomechanics, neuromechanics. All right, Simon.
Okay, well, thank you to the organizers for giving me a chance to speak today. So I'm going to about the drivers, first of all. So there's a need in spinal cord injury. We want to be able to translate from bench to bedside, but also reverse translate from bedside to bench. But there's a problem because spinal cord injury has a smallish population of patients, of affected individuals, compared to stroke or traumatic brain injury. And we also know that from work over many decades, that combination therapies are likely to be the best near-term solutions. So given these together, we have problems in terms of setting up the studies. Also, spinal cord injury has broad pervasive effects. So there are multiple outcomes or parameters across bowel, bladder, autonomic, sensory, motor, and respiratory functions. So how many of these do we monitor? In a given experiment, how are we going to make our choices? Further, secondary effects occur over timescales of weeks, months, and years, both in laboratory rats and in people. So there's a significant issue here in terms of design, getting to clinic, number of people that we may be able to enroll if we get to clinical trials. And also, there are issues in terms of just doing the basic science to produce things that can go to clinical trial eventually. Historically, there have been many proposed treatments for spinal cord injury over the decades, from different kinds of transplantation, different pharmacotherapies, a range of different protective, regenerative, and also bionic and stimulation types of technologies. There's been failures to translate preclinical effects to patients with spinal cord injury. There are ongoing clinical trials, but there have been many failures. So there's a clear need to ensure robustness of the basic science findings. That's been an issue. And also to maximize the information yield in given animals when we're performing experiments. So the animal experiments in spinal cord injury are difficult. There is mortality, there are all kinds of the sequelae that complicate the handling of the animals, the survivability, and we also need then to align these with trials. So in terms of maximizing information, the community as a whole has taken a range of different approaches. One is to try and record as many outcomes as possible, and then use some kind of dimensionality reduction to come down to a small number of variables that we can then analyze. But to some extent, that may lead to problems with interpretability. So interpretation, validation, and understanding of causality in some kind of reduced PC space or whatever can be tricky. But it's also been successful, so in the compilation of large data for new discoveries. So Adam Ferguson and colleagues in particular have done some very interesting things with old bodies of data, such as the Mascis body of data on rodent experiments. Then we need to basically have robust translation, and the community, again, is aware of problems with replication and verification of effects. So there's been many failures of replication in NIH-funded studies. If you have many, many outcomes, then there are the multiple comparison issues. Often in the literature, the methods have been vaguely described, as Dr. Ioannidis alluded to. There are variations in animals, and there are many variations in different spinal cord injury models. I work on spinal complete transection, surgical transection. It's not really a good clinical model, but in my own research, it gives me a very clean framework for analysis. But that means it's not easily translatable. Okay, we need robustness of effects across injury models, across species, and across contexts. So a mouse is not a rat, is not a cat, is not a monkey, and is not a person. There are scaling effects. Biomechanics is something I care about. Biomechanical scaling means the control options for a spinal injured animal are very different at the level of a mouse versus at the level of a cat. The numbers that are possible vary among the species, and the kinds of things that one can do vary across the range of species. You're not going to do as many cats or primates as you do mice. So, and then the question also arises, how much precision in spinal cord injury models is too much? So if we have intense surgical precision, very, very precise injury methods, and very, very precise outcome measures, we have a very well-controlled experiment. But real spinal cord injury is messy. It happens in a range of different levels. It happens in different ways. Every individual's different. Some have hypertension. Some are young, able-bodied adults. Others are older. How is all that going to that means that something which is very robust in a very tightly controlled model may not become robust once you begin to add in all these other variables. So the community as a whole, the spinal cord injury community, has had a responses to this. So there have been explicit efforts in the community from both the federal funding agencies and within the community itself, collaboratively to promote replication and verification. There's been efforts to accumulate large data sets and to use new data exploration methods to identify meaningful factors for intervention and interpretation. There's an attempt at strict attention to statistical issues, but as we know, these are quite complicated, especially as we begin to go into dimensionality reduction frameworks and to start looking at large data mining. In my own work, we try to do a specific kind of hypothesis-driven dimensionality reduction, and then explicit hypothesis testing based on those results. And I think that basically gives us more confidence in the outcomes. But dimensionality reduction on its own can lead, as I say, to problems with interpretation. Obviously, there always has to be some way of going back to a kind of causal Popperian framework where we're discounting hypotheses and narrowing things down. So this is also important to recognize the limitations of scope in a given study. So the community has had basically from as early as 2003 and before, there's been a robust effort to replication. So there have been these 4 facilities of research excellence in spinal cord injury proposals and centers. First of all, at the Reeve Irvine Center in California and the Miami project, subsequently also in Ohio. And go back here. So these basically deal with replication, and there are many failures of replication in these frameworks, but these then allow us, or allow the community, to assess how likely something is to translate well into the clinic, and also to identify factors which maybe weren't thought about in the initial analyses of the data. So this is an example from the 2012 edition of Experimental Neurology dealing with these replication issues, in which it turned out that an initial effort at replication failed. Subsequent communication between the center involved in replication and the original investigators led to the notion that the differences in the two replications were due to anisotropy in the spinal cord, which led to very different hemorrhaging patterns in the two kinds of tests, and that basically refined the original model. So the replication effort in this way, ongoing, is something the communities are very much aware of. Also aware of producing significant new data to allow data mining. So I guess the conclusion is that I think spinal cord injury research in some ways embodies a lot of the problems that we're talking about and concerned about as a community overall. At the same time, there has been a robust effort to deal with some of these issues, with replication and the potential pitfalls and issues. And alignment of animal models with clinical research, the robust response is, in the long term, I think, hopefully leading to more credible results. And it requires really strong inter-center and within-center communication and resources. The kinds of replications we're talking about are not possible just lab to lab. They're rather center to lab relationships, and having people close by who have additional skills that can be brought to bear on the problem. So this is really, it requires a strong community effort. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Simon. All right, our last panelist in giving us another lens and looking at issues of data interpretation and credibility is Dr. Aaron Roth. So Dr. Aaron Roth holds the title of the 1940 Bicentennial Term Associate Professor. It kind of sounds like a movie. And is the Associate Professor in Computer and Information Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a mathematician, and his chief interests are in algorithms, machine learning, specifically the area of private data analysis, fairness, and machine learning, game theory, and mechanism design and learning theory. He has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, and at the University of Pennsylvania, he's affiliated with the Theory Group in the Warren Center for Network Data Sciences and the Applied Mathematics and Computational Science Group. He is co-director of University of Pennsylvania's program in Network and Social Systems Engineering. He was a postdoc at Microsoft Research in New England. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, also an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, a Google Faculty Award, and a Yahoo Academic Career Enhancement Award. Before you go, I just want to say, people, as you're thinking about your questions, just the framing that this session is about data interpretation and credibility, and I didn't really say that in the beginning, but we can look at the problems that you're addressing from all sides, but as your minds are generating. And also, when we do have the questions after Aaron, when you come up, please also share who you are and what institution you're at. So just be thinking about that. So, all right, Aaron.
Thank you very much. So I'm the odd man out here in that I don't use data, I prove theorems. But hopefully I can tell you a little bit about what I do and that you'll find a little bit interesting. So I don't try to tackle the entire scope of this enormous problem of problems with data reproducibility. Instead, I'm going to try to focus in on a very specific aspect of that problem that in my community we call adaptivity. So we all know that this problem of preventing what's called false discovery in the empirical sciences and overfitting in machine learning is a really old subject. There's all sorts of tools, false discovery rate control, the good old-fashioned holdout method. But The problem with these tools is that they're designed for what I would call static data analysis. And static data analysis is what you learned in high school in your introductory biology class or something. It's sort of the sort of Platonic form of the scientific method, right? What you're supposed to do is first you're supposed to plan out your study, decide what hypotheses you're going to test. Then you collect your data, and then you see what happens. You test them and you get some outcome. And what you're not supposed to do is, after you see what the outcome is, go back and get some new idea from the data and revise your method and do it again. Okay? If you have that second arrow there, right, if you revise and go back, that's what I would call adaptive data analysis. And this is, I would say, likely the norm in most scientific methodologies, because of course you want to learn from the data. Okay, but the problem is that breaks are our favorite sort of techniques for guaranteeing scientific validity generally. So this form of adaptivity was given a very nice name, I think, by Gelman and Loken in an article they wrote initially of this title called The Garden of the Forking Paths. So if you think about an adaptive data analysis procedure where what I'm going to do is I'm going to test some hypothesis or run some regression, then look at the outcome of that analysis and then go back and do something else. If you plotted out everything that I could have done in every different eventuality, what you would get is a decision tree like this. Right? First I'd run my first analysis, Q1, and then as a function of the outcome of that, I would do some second thing, some second analysis, Q2, that depends on the outcome of the first thing. Okay, so on and so forth. And so if in the end I run, D analyses on my data, each one adaptively making choices based on the outcomes of the previous ones, the number of things that I could have done is vastly larger. It's exponential in D. So the sort of problem with this is it results in just a sort of exponential explosion in what you might call an implicit multiple comparisons problem. Okay, so it's not enough when you're adaptively using the data to run, say a simple Bonferroni correction or something more complicated just on the analyses that you actually carried out, just on, say, the D hypotheses that you actually tested. But instead, if you wanted to do this correctly, you'd have to correct for all of the exponentially many hypotheses you might have tested had the analyses come out differently. Okay, and that's an enormous problem, not just because, a sort of correction at that order of magnitude would probably destroy all power in your study, but that it's generally impossible even to plot out this tree, to map this garden of the forking paths when, for example, human beings are making decisions, because you don't know how to answer those counterfactual questions. What would you have done had the answers come out differently? Okay, so this has led to, I would say, a series of derogatory terms being applied to the practice of data analysis, adaptive data analysis, things like p-hacking and data dredging and harking, and this has led to lots of high-profile retractions recently in psychology and most recently in food science. So pre-registration is one solution. It's gaining popularity. It's effective, but it is costly. Right? The effect of pre-registration is essentially to gate off this garden of the forking paths, and it works, but it's potentially more limiting than is necessary, and it's costly, especially when data is expensive to gather. So some of my work is looking for principled ways to reuse data, to explore this garden and combine exploratory and confirmatory data analysis while still being able to attach to your analyses, statistically rigorous confidence intervals. So I won't, say too much about the mathematics, although I'll give you some pointers at the end to look it up. But let me just say that there's a deep connection between techniques that were developed for the purpose of data privacy and getting statistical validity in adaptive data analysis. And if you think about it for a little bit, that's not as surprising as maybe it seems at first blush, because what we're trying to do when we design algorithms for conducting private analyses of data are to get statistically meaningful insights about the distribution from which the data was drawn without revealing too much about the particular individuals in the data set. And that's sort of also what we're trying to do when we're trying to conduct statistically valid analyses of data sets without overfitting or without finding false discoveries. We don't want to fit the noise in the data. We want to learn only from the distribution. And there's a very close mathematical relationship between this idea of overfitting and of identifying individuals in the data set, which makes sense. You can't overfit without overfitting the particular entries in your data set. Okay, so I don't want to oversell this stuff. Where we are at the moment is that we can sort of prove what I would say are impressive results in theory that allow you to do all sorts of things at a cost that is only a little bit more than what you'd have if you had no adaptivity at all. But we're a long way off from these techniques being usable in practice. At the moment, we've got algorithms that are sort of, I would say, difficult to work with. There's parameters to set. They have unreasonable run times. There's a lot of work to be done, but this is early days. Okay, so let me sit down now, but with my colleague Adam Smith, we taught a course on this. I have 3 minutes. Okay, well, okay. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about what I mean then. So it's not, of course, that you can go and run arbitrary, data analyses and then look up our theorems and say everything's okay, because we know that everything's not okay. Okay, the kinds of tools that we've been developing allow you to interact with the data in sort of a structured manner. Okay, rather than asking a question of the data and getting the answer that you would get if you sort of exactly computed it on the data, you get an answer that has been perturbed a little bit. So perhaps if you want to compute some test statistic on the data from which you're eventually going to compute a p-value, you're going to get back a perturbed version of this test statistic perturbed with a noise distribution that you understand. So it's still possible to do statistical analyses. And the result of this kind of perturbation, and by the way, it might seem a little bit counterintuitive at first that in an effort to increase the accuracy of your analyses, you would actively destroy that accuracy, actively add noise. But the reason that's a good thing to do is because it's sort of expressly trading off a little bit of additional accuracy today on the analysis that you are doing right now for sort of increased confidence in the results that you will come up with tomorrow. Okay, so maybe like one takeaway of this literature that I've been working in is that we should view statistical validity as a budgeted resource that we can slowly expend, okay? And we can precisely quantify, if we think about it the right way, the rate at which different kinds of analyses expend this resource. Okay, you can potentially expend it very quickly when you start doing adaptive data analyses, and that's why pre-registration is so valuable. It sort of forces you to not use any of it. But with more careful accounting, you can, you don't have to give up entirely the ability to do exploratory data analysis on the same valuable, potentially hard to gather data set on which you eventually want to do confirmatory data analysis, so long as you take the proper statistical precautions. Okay, so for anyone who wants to read some math, my colleague and I taught a course on this topic, and we've got some lecture notes, and thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Your slides will all be out there public, so they can link to those great lecture notes and everyone else's slides as well. So now is the time for questions, and so people who have questions can come up to the two speakers and think about your questions. As I said, the panel is looking at data interpretation and credibility, but any topic, broadly speaking, of our panelists. So, let's see.
Hi, yeah, very interesting session so far. So I'm Gail Rosen from Drexel. I work in bioinformatics and the microbiome. And a lot of times in my field, you know, I look at social media online and a paper has been published with data that's out there, and somebody will actually find, you know, something about the data that may be off. So I'm wondering, you know, how does this affect data interpretation by different parties? You know, a paper may publish something, but yet later they find different aspects of the data that may be wrong. So how does this affect interpretation down the road?
Well, I can. Is this on? Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think this goes back to what the keynote speaker mentioned also, that we can publish results and then somebody else uses the data and disputes those results. I think with the social media data, it's fairly new, at least in the social sciences, that I'm not sure whether the methodologies or the standards in which you actually report what you did. So that's why I think it's very important in these journals to ask for the data or the code or whatever you use to at least have a methodological appendix in a way that someone else can evaluate what they did. I think with social media data it may be particularly difficult, but I think that in my field there are more and more courses and training for individuals now. In Princeton has a program, not sure, I was thinking that we should do something at Penn to coordinate a little bit on this, but I think it's an issue everywhere. But I think it relates to what the keynote speaker said about the replicability, and with social media data, it may be just even more difficult at this point.
I just want to repeat the question for the recording. The question follow-up was, should there be ways of reporting the new results, so for repeatability, right? Okay, thank you. So go ahead, Simon, please.
Well, I think that with the right incentivization, then there are methods for doing that. So, and certainly in the spinal cord injury area, there have been explicit funding mechanisms to allow that augmentation, have the failure to replicate, and all of the details of that become a publishable unit. So definitely it should be out there. I guess the other thing is maybe whether the data itself is always fully available. And certainly in the modularity area that I work in a lot, ideally you'd like the same data sets to be analyzed with all of the different tools that we can bring to bear, because we all get a little bit religious about the different kinds of dimensionality reduction we use. And it's important, although most of the time they come to the same conclusion, they come to the same sets of modules in the motor areas. Nonetheless, we'd like to have everybody analyze all the data sets any which way they choose. That's not always the case, but ideally we would.
I want to add one thing. I think with the social media data, we don't know how representative it's of a given population. So when you go back and get another sample of the social media data, it might be a different population, and the results might vary just because of who the data represents.
Any other comments on that question? Thanks, that was a great question. We have another question. Terrific.
Good morning. I'm Marcia McNutt. I'm president of the National Academy of Sciences. Sorry, I kind of get down here. Question for you. So many times it is actually the data sets that result from these studies that can be more important than the interpretation or the conclusions that come out of them. And the data sets live on much longer than the actual study. So with that in mind, what would you as a panel look for in a data set that assures you that it is of high quality, it is well calibrated, it is well validated, and it is actually worth investing in terms of long-term curation.
Yes, sure. Well, I think that from the point of view of the work I'm involved in, part of it is the kinds of interpretation it's initially been subject to is, and then in terms of the metadata, whether the metadata is of sufficient quality to then be able to take it and work with it appropriately. Very often, a lot of the details are really not as well organized and complete as one would like. So I think maybe there's two things there. Does the interpretation challenge you in ways that really lead you to go in and want to find something out? Is there a hypothesis coming out of that data that is worth looking at? And I think that's a key aspect of this, is whether a particular data set could be, it could be mined for a lot of different reasons if it's sufficiently high quality, and then we just think of it as a data object. But the other driver is it pushing you in new directions so to then have the impetus to go in there and do more.
Another thing that I would say is that, as you point out, it's often the data set that results from a study, which is sort of the most valuable thing. But there's this inherent tension between the need for data sharing, which is very important because good data is hard to come by, and desire to sort of do science, purely non-adaptively and pre-register your studies, because I can be as careful as I want within my own lab, but if the way I've come to my study is I've read your paper, and then I've got some idea for a hypothesis to test, and then I get the same data set that you gathered and test it on that data set, there's already adaptivity sort of baked in there that's very hard to control. So reusing data sets, this is something, by the way, that happens quite a lot in machine learning, where there are these standard benchmark data sets that the community is basically iteratively overfitting, as years go by. The need to reuse data makes it especially important to think about statistical validity as a resource that is being expended.
In my field, most of the data sets that we use are large scale. Many of them are funded by NIH that go through peer review process, either initially or also when extensions, and many of our longitudinal data sets, though, they have repeated peer review as part of the NIH panels. The other thing that I think is valuable about them is that, and some examples here would be the health and retirement study and the adolescent health survey, longitudinal survey, where the individuals are now in their early 40s, and that they are publicly available. Either some version of the data are publicly available, other data are available under data user agreement, so there are hundreds of studies who have used this data, and there's a lot of, because it's highly used, many of these are highly used data sets, there's a lot of evaluation of the quality of the data in terms of missingness, replicability, and so I think the publicly available data, I know in the medical sciences it's a lot harder, and some of the NIH data sets that are clinically based are difficult to access even. But I think the replicability and making them publicly available is important. And that, to some extent, also gives you a better idea of the quality of the data.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think the quality is key. So at least, so for example, an example that comes to mind is the Mascus data set in spinal cord injury. It's basically multi-center animal spinal cord injury study. And that was something that was carried out with very, very great care across many centers. And the metadata, although I think it was kind of a little bit it took some mining to get the metadata, but the metadata was very, very strong. The study itself was very, very carefully conducted, and then mining that has also recently proved very useful. So it's having all of those things together. If you're just treating the data set as just an object that can be mined, I think you want to have all of those things with the highest fidelity.
So in my field, it's reputation of the investigator, which is
Yeah.
Just for recording purposes, you're talking about the reputation of the researcher being key. So, yeah.
I was going to say it was interesting that no one mentioned reputation of the investigator, because that in my field can be overriding.
Thank you.
I actually want to make a comment about that. I think that's key, but that can also then keep new investigators from having access to the funding resources, and I would argue sometimes the younger investigators can be more innovative and may have new ideas and new ways of testing, so I think that's the reputation for a new investigator is more difficult to assess.
Yeah, and so very often it is the postdocs and students of people who have come from those labs that inherit that careful protocol that then carry the mantle. Yeah.
All right. I just will go on to the next question in a second, but I'm just very happy that the word metadata came up. And I just want to interject that thinking about metadata affiliated with the life cycle of the data set, and the technologies are there to automatically track the data adaptation and reuse, but we don't always implement them, and we really should be implementing them. So another question?
Sure, Dr. Goldman from Drexel. It may be a question mainly for, or potentially for Dr. Ioannidis regarding the timing of release of data between, there's, I'm often involved in the original sponsors and people executing the data often want to hold it back as long as possible so they can get the most out of it, versus that delay often decreases the relevance. People may have moved on to other more exciting topics. So there's this intrinsic conflict between the quality of the investigator and, there's certainly, not to speak against the expertise of the original investigators, but in looking at secondary analyses, there's often criticism of secondary analysis by less experienced investigators that you somehow must not be doing something right. So I was wondering if you could, and certainly for the panel as well, to comment on the timing of release of data.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much. Panelists?
That's a hotly debated question, obviously. In principle, my personal perspective is in favor of the earliest possible release, provided that there is some understanding in that scientific community on who is doing what, who is getting credit for that. So there's some clear rules of operation and transparency and willingness to acknowledge what each investigator has done. I would argue that increasingly we face circumstances where releasing the data in time zero makes perfect sense. Even give zero time to the data generator to have like an early lead on the database. To give you one example, in many omics fields, the data generator may have very limited computational ability and capacity compared to many other scientists who are much better situated to look not only at his or her data set, but hundreds and thousands of other similar data sets and make sense and reach something credible, while each one of these hundreds of investigators would just go nowhere. So in that case, it makes sense to give full credit to the data generator for generating the data and giving credit to whatever else stems from that, but just release them immediately and have even zero lead compared to the advantage that we see in other fields, like many epidemiology fields, where I see many of my colleagues say, but we still want to use the data, and you look, well, you have published over 1,000 papers already with them. Why do you want to keep them still closed?
Good. Thank you very much. Thanks for that question. I see at least one panelist shaking her head. So do you guys want to comment, each of you, or other thoughts?
Well, I think part of it comes down to the incentive framework. That holding on to the data for some length of time to complete analyses that your students or postdocs need to perform for their careers I think is reasonable. And in the context of potentially competition for those analyses, then you're disadvantaging your own people. So I think that has to be taken into account at least. I understand the desire to release everything as soon as possible. I agree with that, but I think you also have to somehow make the cottage industry that's a lab also work for the people in it.
Okay, and we have one more question, unless you guys want to make anybody want to make a comment on this last point?
Yeah, maybe just to
Brief.
say something a little controversial.
Yeah.
Releasing all of the data right away sounds great, but again, thinking about statistical validity as a limited resource, maybe in the long run we should sort of think more carefully about how we grant access to it and take inspiration from economics and from markets and think about allocating it carefully. Because if you're correcting for multiple comparisons problems, there's no difference between correcting for 1,000 comparisons done by one investigator and one comparison done by 1,000 investigators. And if we want to take seriously reproducibility, not just at the level of individual scientists, but as a field as a whole, then I think we might have to think carefully about how we allocate these limited resources.
Thank you. All right, this will be our last question.
Hello, Darryl Brown from Drexel University School of Public Health. And in my work at Drexel, I also sit on the medical IRB. And I like to think that what we do is important, but I really haven't heard anything about let's say, the filtering or the purpose of IRBs as a gatekeeper in this role.
Good question. Go ahead.
Well, I think that gets back to the issues of confidentiality and whether, all of us who do research on humans, we do have to have some IRB. And, but I think it becomes harder when we are using data sources that are not data sources that we're collecting ourselves. Because when you do data collection, obviously you have to get informed consent from the participant. But I think it gets more murky when you get into the use of administrative record data for individuals and linking it for their personnel records. And often it's sort of ambiguous whether that is publicly available or whether the individual has given consent. And I think that's where, and so some of these ethical issues, even using social media data, and I guess getting into identifying individuals in the data sets. The more information you link, the more information you have of that individuals, and it becomes potentially identifiable. And I think that's what has now led to the making data only available, at least national level data, collected by federal government and others in sort of very restricted data environments where you can't have the data on your computer, but you have to actually analyze it elsewhere and someone else looks at your results. So I think those issues, as we do more data linkages and maybe this kind of what you mentioned is using the data and potentially identifying individuals, those issues will become more important.
I want to make, I guess, a parallel comment. So I'm an animal researcher, so rather than the IRB, I deal with the IACUC. But similar kinds of issues may arise in the sense that the IACUC is seeking for the most humane use of animals and the minimal use of animals. So to some extent, replication of studies is something that the IACUC will look at and say, well, you've already done this study. If you are arguing maybe it's a new control in the new context, then maybe it would fly. But certainly in the field of replication, there has been a tension between the IACUC and the needs of replication.
Thank you. All right. I think we're pretty much out of time. I had a bunch of questions here that I was saving in case there weren't questions, but we had enough questions, but I'm going to be tracking you guys down because you have my questions in your box, your inbox, and I'd like to ask you. But let's give a hand to the panelists again, and thank you for your questions.